A Revolution Summed Up. The Great Lessons of October 17. International Communist Party. What distinguishes our party, the line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian Communist left against the degeneration in Moscow, and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalition of resistance groups. The tough work of restoring the revolutionary doctrine and the party organ in contact with the working class, outside the realm of personal politics and electoralist maneuvering. Introduction. Bilan d'une Revolution was written in 1967 to 68 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and appeared in our French-language theoretical magazine at the time, Programma Comunista. It is fully aligned with all of the theoretical work of Marxism from its foundation text in 1848 to the current epoch. At the time of writing, everyone on the entire bourgeois political spectrum, from conservative to Trotskyist, presented the USSR as communist. Western conservatives and liberals delighted in pointing to the Soviet Union as a monolith that threatened freedom and world peace, as well as the relative poverty of a Russian working class. The existence of an imperialist rival with an alien ideology was used to justify not only massive increases in arms expenditure, but also the infiltration and corruption of cultural, scientific, and educational institutions as part of a global offensive against any emergence, however weak, of resistance to capitalism. In reality, the USSR was no match for the USA and its NATO allies. Social Democrats, for their part, insisted that the aftermath of 1917 demonstrated the danger of revolution. Socialism could only be achieved through the slow process of democratic reform, and radical socialism only played into the hands of conservatives. A few years before this text was written, the German Social Democratic Party, also known as the SDP, once the jewel in the crown of proletarian movement, formally and definitively removed all reference in its constitution to Marxism and the class struggle. The Stalinist and post-Stalinist official communist parties, at the peak of their electoral influence in countries such as France and Italy in 1967, systematically falsified Marxism and the theses defended by Lenin in their efforts to present the USSR as a workers' paradise. Trotskyists added to the confusion, falsely portraying the Soviet economy as essentially socialist, while calling for an overthrow of the bureaucracy. In the mid-60s, a variety of new libertarian communist and third worldist critiques of the Soviet Union emerged, as well as that other great polluter of proletarian theory and practice, Maoism. The democratic and self-managerial deviations of the so-called New Left moved further and further away from an authentic Marxism, but were often co-opted by parties claiming a Marxist heritage, such as the Socialist Workers' Party in the United Kingdom. So, the ideological mush was complete. It is the task of our party, the International Communist Party, to debunk all of these falsifications and restore the crystal-clear doctrine of revolutionary Marxism. The victory of the counter-revolution in Russia was not the result of a fatal flaw in Bolshevism, such as the lack of party democracy, nor of an alleged invincibility of the bourgeoisie and the capitalist mode of production. Nor was the revolution defeated on the field of battle. Lenin and the Bolsheviks knew perfectly well that it ran counter to everything Marxism teaches to believe, that the revolution could survive in an isolated and backward country like Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution must be understood as Lenin understood it, in the context of proletarian internationalism. Communist-led Russia only lasted a few years, and Marxist orthodoxy was gradually abandoned. process that started during Lenin's final illness. The interests of the Russian state were then placed before those of the international revolution. There is no need to list here all the crimes committed against the working class of all countries to the interest of Stalin's Russia. Suffice it to say that in 1943 the Russians themselves acknowledged the uselessness of the International and abolished it. For Stalin and the clique around him, the corrupted Marxist language of the class struggle provided a suitable foil for carrying through the entirely capitalist reforms at great human cost, notably through the dekulakization campaign. The retreat of the Western Communist parties of the 1920s, then of the International, enabled opportunism, democratism, class collaborationism, popular frontism, and political and economic romanticism to flourish in leftist and pseudo-Marxist circles. Developments in Russia since 1967 have been entirely in line with our party's expectations, though nobody could have predicted the exact form they would take. In China, for example, the evolution of the political superstructure has followed a different course. As shown in this final section of this work, the process of liberalization of the Soviet economy, in other words, its steady adjustment to capitalist norms, began in the 1950s with the reform of Khrushchev era. By the late 80s, in the Gorbachev era, it was clear to many in the Soviet leadership that the USSR was too bankrupt, dictatorial, and over-centralized to keep pace with its main competitor, the USA. But as the communist left had pointed out since the Stalinist counter-revolution of the mid to late 20s, the direction of the USSR was entirely capitalist and bourgeois. Wherever wage labor, capital, and an economy based on exchange exist, we are in the realm of capitalism. Its economic cycles and the falling rate of profit. This, quite simply, and has always been the authentic Marxist position. Despite the terrible ideological defeat suffered by the working class that has resulted from this betrayal, by all schools of thought across the bourgeois spectrum, of the Soviet Union as communist, we know that this defeat is not definitive. That is why, in August 1991, we published an article entitled "Communism is Dead, Long Live Communism." It was not communism that was dead, but rather the false myth of socialism in one country. We asserted in the past that when the Russian myth had collapsed, as was bound to happen, we shouldn't expect an honest recognition of our foresight, but rather, if anything, oppression or silence. And such it is. But this is not what rankles. We anticipate and know that an entire historical cycle must come to a close for communism to arise again as an urgent necessity. The national roads to socialism have degenerated into conflicts, which, though apparently ethnic and racist, are in fact nothing other than the expressions of struggles within the bourgeois class, camouflaged in the most horrible and cannibalistic way. The communist left was the only current that made a thorough Marxist analysis of Soviet Russia's degeneration. Our critique of the USSR began with the famous intervention at 1926 6th Enlarged Executive of the Communist International, which was the subject of organic works presented at our general meetings through the 1950s. Of these, the economic and social structures of Russia today are an outstanding example and is being translated and published in our international magazine, Communist Left. All of our work demonstrates that the USSR was nothing more than a capitalist state, distinguished from Western capitalist state merely by the amount of state capital present in its industrial and commercial enterprises. A phenomenon already envisaged by the Marxists, notably in Friedrich Engels, Anti-Düring of 1878, which is cited at length in Part 2 of this work. The alleged fall of communism that took place in 1991 proved that a centralized and planned capitalism is impossible. The USSR was nothing other than a fascistic state, one of many versions of this capitalist rule, and even proved unable to convert to a democratic regime as demonstrated by Putin's tricks to stay in power forever with the persecution of opponents, selected assassinations and the rigging of elections, and most recently, the 2020 referendum on the Constitution. The really strong bourgeois state is the one that can control the population by means of deception, flattery, fine phrases, promises by the million, in quoting Lenin, through the mass media, school religion, flags, national anthem, and other democratic paraphernalia, resorting to violence only in extreme situations. Nevertheless, the material pressure exerted by the economic laws of capitalism will push the working class to rebel against worsening living and working conditions. Whereas in 1967, the industrialized countries were at the peak of the post-war boom, since then inequality has grown and economic crises have worsened, while capitalism, unable to free itself from its own iron laws, rampages through the environment and destroys public health. Despite all the technological advances that have taken place since '67, only revolutionary Marxism can make sense of this anarchy and offer a way forward not just for the working class but for the whole of humanity. This first translation of the great Marxist texts broadly covers the three main themes. In Part 1, it examines what the Bolshevik Revolution was and what it was not. In Part 2, it considers the various false interpretations of October 17, and in Part 3, it explores in much greater depth the most pernicious falsification of all modern-day Trotskyism, while hailing the unparalleled contribution of Trotsky himself to proletarian theory and practice. In Parts 4, 5, and 6, the text goes on to examine the development of the Russian economy from the new economic policy of the early 1920s through Stalin's struggles against the Marxist left and Marxist right of the Bolshevik Party up to the time the text was written in 1967 to 68. This book is dedicated to the new generation of militants who are rediscovering the Marxist doctrine of proletarian internationalism and communist revolution. August 2020. Part 1. The Great Lessons of October 17. What now is happening to Marxist theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressed classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. End quote. When he wrote these lines at the beginning of the State and Revolution, Lenin certainly did not think that the same quote-unquote destiny would be reserved for quote-unquote his thought, and still less for that brilliant Red October to which he would soon indissolubly attach his name. It was with the most savage malice that the armies of the international bourgeoisie threw themselves against the communist dictatorship in Russia, hotbed of the world proletarian revolution for which it proclaimed itself as the first fortress and beacon, and from which it would never have dreamt of separating its own fate. For years, the guardians of capital maintained a cordon sanitaire around the Prussian powder keg with military interventions and political counterattacks. The bourgeois counter-revolution stopped at nothing in its efforts to prevent the revolutionary flame of October from spreading to the citadels of the capitalist West and destroying them in the fire of the socialist revolution. Where weapons were not enough, and they weren't enough, the heavy artillery of lies and slander was mobilized, and when even this proved powerless, the servile infantry of opportunism launched an assault from behind the barrage fire of capital. And for good reason. The bourgeoisie knew, better than any other class, that October was a living example, a vivid lesson that it was not just a local or national event, rather over there in Russia, a link in the chain of its world domination had been broken. Since then, 50 years have passed. The bourgeoisie of all countries has forgotten how terrified it was at the time, and for it, October has passed into history. It is a museum piece, a body without a soul, a blunt-edged weapon. There is no longer any reason to prevent its commemoration. October is dead, or so they think. The heirs and successors of the worst opponents of the Bolsheviks all those years ago can sing their praises with impunity, so well by mummifying the body of Lenin and by sanctifying his name. Having distorted the content of his doctrine, can commemorate him at their ease. Just like the leaders of the classical bourgeois powers, they have put October into the archives. Have they not used a crucial moment in the tragic history of the world-class struggle to mark the date of birth of the modern state of the Russias? Have they not turned this flag, this beacon of the world proletarian revolution, into the rallying point of a strict national interests? October belonged to the international proletariat. They made it the property of capital that accumulates behind the well-defended borders of Russia. They transformed this fiery lesson hurled at the new generations of the oppressed class into a miserable catechism for the young lions of one country among so many others. For them, the origins of October are Russian, exclusively Russian, and the same goes for his historical results. October is 50 years old. One goes to the mausoleum out of conscience. One does not go there to remember and learn. October is dead. May she rest in peace. In 1918, Lenin exclaimed, quote, that the Russian Revolution is only a sample, only the first step in a series of revolutions, unquote. And in 1919, quote, in essence, the Russian Revolution was a dress rehearsal for world proletarian revolution, unquote. For the Central Committee of the CPSU's band of mystifiers, whose arid, quote-unquote, collegial brain created the theses for the 50th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. It is, on the contrary, an exception to the rule, a unique historical phenomenon never to be repeated. Also, once its roots, which resided in the global antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, had been cut off. The archivist on duty could well say with an expert coldness that October exercised a very profound influence on the entire successive course of world history. World history no longer being the history of classes, but all of humanity, priests and henchmen included. In exactly the same way that a rock detaches itself from the mountain and sets others in motion mechanically without imposing a determined direction on them, so too they argue that other countries are free to follow their own national, exclusive, inimitable path toward a goal that remains unknown to us, since it is up to the mysterious national genius, with all its national history, traditions, and pantheon, to define it. with its origins, its very nature as a collective heritage of single class, and its international perspectives thus classified in the museum of a false and frozen history. October is dead and buried. Or so they think, but we only have to read the 2 citations from Lenin above to remind ourselves that this was not how the Marxists fought the great battle of October, nor why they commemorated it one year after another, nor is it what the Bolsheviks thought and felt. Marxism would not be a guide to action, as they repeat ad nauseum, reversing the meaning of the formula, if it were not a general and complete conception for the emancipation of the working class. The proletariat has no fatherland, therefore all the more need for program. And if it did not seek, in the great periods of upheaval in which the classes take up arms for a merciless struggle, the verification of its forecasts, drawing from the facts themselves, the impetus that throw these forecasts into sharper relief, giving them flesh and blood, and thanks to the persuasive force of historical facts, making them irrevocable. In 1848 to 49 and 1871, it was through contact with class battles that Marx and Engels sharpened the weapons of criticisms. But battles whose outcome did not concern the French or German proletariat, but the world proletariat. Attention is fixed on Petrograd, but Petrograd is not just Petrograd, it is also London, Berlin, or Paris. In The State and Revolution, Lenin returns to these brilliant verifications of doctrine, and as in the whole period from 1905 to 1917, he foresees their translation into real historical events, not just Russian, but global. The grandiose sketch drawn in 1850 in the address of the Central Committee of the League of Communists, just as Trotsky had borrowed from it the famous battle cry of the permanent revolution, in the course of a century and a half of assaults on heaven and falling back into hell, which Marxists have both exalted and cursed, it is always the definitive confirmation of a universal doctrine and program that they have sought, and what they have drawn from it is a certainty of the future, caring less about commemorating the past, because commemorating the past is just another way of burying it. So let them all imagine, both those who think that October is dead and those who think they killed it. It is now up to the revolutionary proletariat to rediscover October and throw it back in the face of all its enemies. In the first chapters of Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, destined to remind communists of all countries of the important international aspects of the October Revolution, Lenin remarks quote, an essential condition of the Bolshevik success, unquote, was the fact that they had to look outside Russia's national frontiers for a theory proved by world experience throughout the 19th century, and subsequently confirmed by the, quote, experience of the seekings and vacillations, the errors and disappointments of revolutionary thought in Russia, unquote. In exactly the same way, Marx and Engels, themselves exiles, had found confirmation of theory in the hesitations and waverings of the petty bourgeois socialists during the great struggles of 1848 and the years preceding the Paris Commune. The Bolsheviks, who proposed, following the program outlined in What Is to Be Done, to import Marxism into the Russian working class, had therefore, in turn, imported it from the West. Their inspiration had not been drawn from the depths of Slavic genius like the Pan-Slavists, nor from the national model of the Mir, like the populists, but from a doctrine that came into being as a single package at the same time as the class of wage laborers, and was made flesh of their flesh through struggle. Nor did they seek sustenance in the specific peculiarities of an area that today would be called underdeveloped, but rather if we can allow the expression in the non-specific peculiarities of the most developed capitalist countries, without ever claiming to have discovered anything new. They knew how to read the book already written by half a century of class struggle and Marxism. Their paths had already been mapped out, their glory, their pride as militants, who had always disdained to claim any particular merits, either for themselves or for their working class, was to have stuck to that path, which was already described as dogmatic in 1903. For Marxism, the revolutionary, or counter-revolutionary, the two terms are dialectically linked. Destiny of Russia is part of the whole, which, since the manifesto, has been by definition global. The shadow of Tsarist Russia, the reserve army of European counter-revolution, obscured the revolutionary prospects of 1848. It was no longer the distant lands of the Sarmatians dear to the bourgeois publicist, but played a leading role in the social drama. Just like Metternich's Austria, without its defeat, the European Revolution could not win. After 1860, while remaining European, which at the time meant global, the Marxist perspective evolved. The looming Russian Revolution will be, quote, of enormous importance for all of Europe, if only by bringing down at once the ultimate reserve of pan-European reaction, intact until now, unquote. It could begin the leap from, quote, from the Russian Obshchina, though greatly undermined, yet a form of primeval common ownership of land, to the higher form of communist common ownership, unquote. If it became, quote, the signal for a workers' revolution in the West so that both complement each other, unquote, in the 1890s, this hypothetical perspective disappeared in its turn. After Russia had entered into the capitalist whirlwind, the anti-feudal and anti-Tsarist revolution promised to be the great upheaval, which, by tearing peasants, quote, out of the isolation of their villages, which form their universe, unquote, and by pushing them, quote, on the great stage where they will learn to know the outside world, and thus also to know themselves, unquote, would give the, quote, Western workers' movement a new impetus, a new and better conditions for struggle, and, by the same token, will bring this victory closer to the modern industrial proletariat, without which today's Russia cannot leave either the commune or capitalism to move towards a socialist transformation, unquote. From its birth, Bolshevism would remain in continuity with this international tradition of Marxism. In Engels' sentences, is there not already the whole Bolshevik perspective of 1905 and 1917, and moreover the framework for a possible counter-revolution that would be realized all too clearly in 1926. For us, the first of the lessons of October, from its brilliant beginnings to its tragic fallout, it is indeed this flawless continuity that the party established 20 years before the revolution, with the historical battles of the proletariat of the countries of fully developed capitalism, and with the general doctrine and program that both announced them and built on them. Without this unbroken link, no victory of the working class has been or ever will be possible. The Bolsheviks were able to embrace 1917, 1848, 1871, or even 1894 with the same outlook. Similarly, it is from the fruitful perspective of the great stages of past struggles in all countries, and their reflections in doctrine, that we must view the future recovery of the class. No other European proletariat assimilated the Marxist doctrine as fully as the Russian proletariat. No other appropriated it as a single block. From 1894, the year of the polemic against Mikhailovsky and Engels afterward to On Social Relations in Russia to 1905, Lenin's struggle can be summed up as a passionate defense of the whole of the Marxist doctrine, both against the prospect of a purely peasant social and political revolution, plunging its roots in the incorruptible heritage of the Mir, which the populace confusedly dreamed of, against the revisionism of the economists, and against the eclectic pragmatism of the spontaneists. At the same time, Lenin highlights the fundamental role of theory, the program, in short, the party, and their quote-unquote importation into the class, openly rejecting any quote-unquote freedom of criticism of the theory or the program. To accept both, Lenin himself says and repeats in their entirety, in their ensemble, globally and without doing them serious injury. This is the other aspect of this continuity, in which we have recognized the fundamental premise and the first quote-unquote lesson of October, considered on the scale of the entire historical course of which it is the center. If the first aspect is theoretical and practical fidelity to the Marxist view, according to which the European Revolution and the Russian Revolution condition each other, and are therefore destined to overcome or succumb together, then what is the other, second aspect, if not the assimilation of theory as a unitary and invariant whole? Two facts themselves, also of an international nature, have shaped its fundamental traits. As Lenin points out in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, quote, oppressed by a most brutal and reactionary Tsarism, unquote, the proletarian vanguard was obliged to seek its theory beyond the national borders in exile, which put it in contact with the greatest struggles, both theoretical and practical, of the European socialist movement. Lenin educated himself in the exiled Plekhanov school. All Bolshevism would educate itself, in turn, at the exiles' Lenin school. Moreover, in no other country has there been concentrated, in so brief a period, such a wealth of forms, shades, and methods of struggle of all classes of modern society. And this last fact was indeed international in nature, since this dynamism was born of the importation of capitalism into a backwards country, the implantation of a fully mature capitalism in a historically and therefore also economically and socially backward area. Master dialecticians as they were, this is where Lenin and Trotsky would seek the key to the future revolution. In our time, said the first, quote, scholastic criteria inspired by an obtuse pedantry are useless. It is the global evolution that has wrestled Russia from its state of backwardness and from its Asiatic barbarism, unquote. And the second would write, quote, the vanguard role of the Russian proletariat in the world working class movement is not due to the economic development of the country. On the contrary, it is the backwardness of Russia, the inability of what is called our native bourgeoisie to cope with the enormous problems connected with the war, and its cessation that have led the proletariat to seize political power and establish its own class dictatorship, unquote. It is precisely this because this economically backward country had seen the state-of-the-art capitalism grafted onto its quote-unquote Asian and barbaric structure, that terrible tremors shook its foundations, that stages were leapfrogged, historical shortcuts taken. This is why the bourgeois and sub-bourgeois classes exhausted in such a short period of time all their chances of intervening directly, of directing and controlling the social and political struggle, and that, barely out of the womb, the proletariat found itself confronting its historic tasks. Faced with the quote-unquote last word in capitalism, it effectively had to serve for the last word in revolutionary doctrine. A doctrine strengthened by having been confirmed by 50 years of history, in which Tsarist absolutism could only confirm firm. This is why its young vanguard demonstrated so early on an extraordinary maturity. That is, it understood so early on the outside of itself that there was no way forward. If Bolshevism had any historical merit, it is that it asserted the invariance of Marxism. That is, it occupied the only platform from which the class called upon to destroy capitalism would not risk sliding into the swamp, as Lenin said in What Is to Be Done. And if after 1917 it was possible to import back into the West the theory that it had forgotten or disfigured, it is thanks to that theory. Those who want to make Marxism as an elastic doctrine, disciples of the creative Marxism of the Kremlin, the ridiculous Maoist Marxism of Beijing, have no right to commemorate October. At its birth, the Russian Marxist movement thus found its path entirely mapped out. 8 years before the revolution of 1905, it perfectly understood that its task was twofold. The object of the practical activities of the Social Democrats was, as it is well known, to lead the class struggle of the proletariat and to organize that struggle in both its manifestations. Socialist, the fight against the capitalist class, aimed at destroying the class system and organizing socialist society, and democratic, the fight against absolutism, aimed at winning political liberty in Russia and democratizing the political and social system of Russia. Political and social, which means first and foremost the destruction of great landed property. To fulfill this, it would have to support, quote-unquote, the progressive social classes against the reactionary classes, the bourgeoisie against the representatives of privileged land-owning estates and the bureaucracy, the big bourgeoisie against the reactionary strivings of the petty bourgeoisie, unquote. But this solidarity will necessarily assume a, quote, temporary and conditional character, unquote. Not only because, quote, the proletariat is a separate class which tomorrow may prove to be the adversary of the Allies today, unquote, but because its, quote, class condition makes it the only class, quote, capable of pushing the democratization of the political and social regime to its limits, since such democratization would place this regime in the hands of the workers, unquote. Following the path traced by the Communist Manifesto, the address of 1850, and the class struggles in France and Germany, the Russian Marxist movement therefore recognized in the proletariat the real protagonist of the imminent revolution, even though it remained locked in democratic and therefore bourgeois limits. Such is the task of the working class in countries which, having not yet accomplished their bourgeois revolution, are subjected from the outside to the pressure of expanding productive forces. It should be noted also that for Lenin, bourgeois and democratic are always synonymous terms, and that if the proletariat must fulfill democratic bourgeois tasks in these countries only, never in those whose capitalism has already traveled through its revolutionary cycle, it must do this in absolute independence from bourgeois classes and parties. It is up to the proletariat, and only the proletariat, to achieve them in full. Today's commemorators have associated with democracy with socialism, putting the party in thrall to the Democrats, even in countries where capitalism is already more than mature. Since this is a bourgeois revolution, the Menshevik pedants would say, both before and after 1905, the initiative and the leadership must be abandoned to the bourgeoisie. Some would even conclude that it was necessary to participate in government alongside it. Drowned in their smoky idealism, the populists, whose supreme goal was the destruction of the great feudal estates, would proclaim on their side that the initiative and the direction should return to the peasantry. Until 1917 and beyond, the position of the Bolsheviks remained, on the contrary, that the economically and socially bourgeois revolution could not be carried through, quote, to the end, unquote, without the working class taking the lead. And if it was ready to take on this enormous burden, it was only because it knew that once the bourgeois revolution was brought to this extreme limit, that the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry will never cross. On the contrary, desperately trying to turn things back, this would open, with the help of the proletariat of the countries of advanced capitalism, the prospect of its own revolution. In 1905, Lenin would say how justified were the, quote, dreams, unquote, of the Russian Marxists who thought they were able to, quote, achieve with unprecedented amplitude all democratic transformations, all their minimum program, unquote, because once that had been attained, quote, the revolutionary fire would extend to all of Europe. The European worker would rise up in turn and show them how to do it, unquote. As for the present-day commemorators, it is they, or their spiritual fathers, who, in China in 1927, delivered the working class bound hand and foot to the party brethren of the Kuomintang, thus preventing the proletariat from taking the lead in the double revolution in the Far East. And again, it is they who in the underdeveloped areas enjoin the workers to put themselves in the Tao of the national bourgeoisie, or even local satraps. In essence, the terms of the Bolshevik perspective would remain unchanged until October. Only the relations between the classes, and thus also the position of the main protagonist of the bourgeois revolution in Russia, the proletariat, would change, also under the influence of the extranational factors. In a world that is very advanced from the point of view of the productive forces, 5 years count for 50 in backward countries. The historical phases overlap and merge into one another. The timelines are shortened, and the fronts of the class war are made and unmade to reform themselves extremely rapidly. The 1850 address foresaw for Germany, and this analysis can be applied to Russia, a break between the revolutionary bourgeoisie on one hand, the petty bourgeoisie, and the united proletariat on the other. Then immediately after, a new break, this time between the petty bourgeoisie and the workers, which should take the form of an armed struggle, leading, provided that the revolution broke out in France, and for Russia we would say in the West, to the socialist revolution, led exclusively by the proletarian class. But for Marx, as for Lenin, of the tasks of the social democracy, periods of history are relatively long, and he foresaw that German workers can only seize power after a long revolutionary development. In Russia, as in all of today's underdeveloped countries, the historical course is, on the contrary, infinitely faster. In 1905, the liberal bourgeoisie had already discharged all of its revolutionary ammunition by openly allying itself with the landed estates and Tsarism. Among the bourgeois classes or subclasses, the peasantry therefore remained the only possible ally. But as Lenin always reminds us, the ally of today will be the enemy of tomorrow. In its impetuous advance, international capitalism has dug a deep ditch between the classes, even, and perhaps above all, in backward countries, forcing them not to leap over entire historical stages, but to shorten them considerably. In Russia, the proletariat was therefore by nature in the vanguard, and we could even see the breaking of the dawn when it would be on its own, abandoned by the only ally that the rupture of the front uniting all the bourgeois classes permitted between February and October. And therein lies another lesson from October, one that only applies to a few regions of the world today, but that is enough for it to remain important. After that, only the obtuse Bonapartism of Stalin and the people around him could decree, as it did in 1926, that once the revolutionary wildfire had broken out in China, it would develop by respecting clearly distinct stages, each of which should be entirely complete before it could move on to the next one, and conclude from this mechanical conception that the proletariat had to wait, massed behind the national classes, for the experts in revolutionary strategy to proclaim its coming hour. The tragic result was, as we know, that he realized too late this hour had irretrievably passed. The brilliant Russian victory, like the crushing Chinese defeat of 1927, showed that the truth was exactly the opposite of this conception. Even if the proletariat is in the background during the first tremors of the social earthquake, it is inevitably pushed to the head of the revolutionary movement at the moment when this earthquake reaches its culmination. So it is no longer up to the proletariat to push the bourgeois revolution to the end, but to seize the rudder by force, and with the support of the peasantry to impose its hegemony on all the other classes of society. The Leninist formula of the democratic dictatorship of workers and peasants has no other meaning. Dictatorship, because you cannot do without despotic interventions or of violent incursions, not so much in the forms of the political superstructure, which are only fragile and secondary aspects of the social upheaval, but in the relations of property, as this is the only way to liberate the productive forces whose development is hampered by the landed aristocracy, and to free the peasants from both central and local absolutism. Democratic dictatorship, because democracy is the political form responding to the bourgeois limitation of the revolution from economic and social perspectives. This dictatorship is nevertheless exercised against the bourgeoisie allied to feudalism, and that is why it does not respect any of the myths of political democracy and legal equality, even if its economic mission is bourgeois. Oh, for Lenin, dear commemorators! Even when it is the question of fulfilling the historic tasks of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat and its party need the terrible, the scandalous, the nonconformist dictatorship, even if it means sharing this with another class like the peasantry. The prospects? It is important to recall them, not for the sake of academic research, but to shed light on the problems of after October. In Two Tactics of Social Democracy, in the Democratic Revolution, written in 1905, Lenin writes, "And such a victory, the decisive victory over Tsarism, will be precisely a dictatorship, i.e., it must inevitably rely on military force, on the arming of the masses, on an insurrection, and not on institutions of one kind or another established in a lawful or peaceful way. It can only be a dictatorship for the realization of the changes which are urgently and absolutely indispensable for the proletariat and the peasantry. It will call forth the desperate resistance of the landlords, the big bourgeoisie, and of Tsarism. Without a dictatorship, it is impossible to break down that resistance and to repel the counter-revolutionary attempts. But of course, it will be a democratic, not a socialist dictatorship. It will not be able, without a series of intermediary stages of revolutionary development, to affect the foundations of capitalism. At best, it may bring about a radical redistribution of landed property in favor of the peasantry, establish consistent and full democracy, including the formation of a republic, eradicate all the oppressive features of Asiatic bondage, not only in the village but also in factory life, lay the foundation for a thorough improvement in the position of workers, and for a rise in the standard of living, And last but not least, carry the revolutionary conflagration into Europe. Such a victory will by no means, as yet, transform our bourgeois revolution into a socialist revolution. The democratic revolution will not directly overstep the bounds of bourgeois social and economic relationships. Nevertheless, the significance of such a victory for the future of development of Russia and of the whole world will be immense." Unquote. Again, quote, "Such a victory will enable us to rouse Europe, and the socialist proletariat of Europe, after throwing off the yoke of the bourgeoisie, will in its turn help us to accomplish the socialist revolution." Unquote. These are Engels' final words, almost verbatim, in his afterword to On Social Relations in Russia. This so-called binary dictatorship is, as Lenin would never fail to repeat, an uninterrupted process of struggles against the past and for the future, during which the proletariat is in reality the force that leads the peasants. Does this vision have anything in common with the idyllic coexistence, pre-established harmony, Trotsky would say, that later, for Stalin's benefit and on his orders, the Academy of so-called Red Teachers would present as the true picture of these good relations between the working class and the peasantry, in which Lenin saw a simple prelude to the final socialist revolution? Let us allow Lenin to reply for himself. Quote, "The time will come when the struggle against Russian autocracy will end and the period of democratic revolution will be over in Russia. Then it will be ridiculous to talk about singleness of will of the proletariat and the peasantry, about a democratic dictatorship, etc. When that time comes, we shall attend directly to the question of the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution, will not directly overstep the boundaries of bourgeois social and economic relationships. Nevertheless, the significance of such a victory for the future development of Russia and of the whole world will be immense." Unquote. Again, quote, "Such a victory will enable us to rouse Europe, and the socialist proletariat of Europe, after throwing off the yoke of the bourgeoisie, will in turn help us to accomplish the socialist revolution." Unquote. These are Engels' final words, almost verbatim, in his afterword to On Social Relations in Russia. This so-called binary dictatorship is, as Lenin would never fail to repeat, an uninterrupted process of struggles against the past and for the future, during which the proletariat is in reality the force that leads the peasants. Does this vision have anything in common with the idyllic coexistence that later, for Stalin's benefit and on his orders, the Academy of Red Teachers would present as the true picture of the good relations between the working class and the peasantry, in which Lenin saw a simple prelude to the final socialist revolution? Let us allow Lenin to reply for himself. Quote, "The time will come when the struggle against Russian autocracy will end and the period of democratic revolution will be over in Russia. Then it will be ridiculous to talk about singleness of will of the proletariat and the peasantry, about a democratic dictatorship, etc. When that time comes, we shall attend directly to the question of the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution by allying itself to the mass of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of the autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution by allying itself to the mass of semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie." Unquote. It is certain, in fact, that when the proletariat enters the fray for its own demands, or even when it simply poses the limited demand that a bourgeois revolution led by the bourgeois classes should satisfy, but never actually satisfies, namely, the nationalization of the land, a terrible struggle will be unleashed, and, quote, the peasantry, as a landowning class, will play the same treacherous, vacillating part as is now being played by the bourgeoisie in the struggle for democracy, unquote. Aware that the, quote, small owner will inevitably turn against the proletariat after the complete victory of the democratic revolution, unquote, the Bolsheviks, Lenin in the lead, turned their eyes to the European Revolution. Quote, our democratic republic has no other reserves than the socialist proletariat of the West, unquote. If we have insisted on the October prologue at the risk of sacrificing part of the quote-unquote epic it represents, it is because opportunism strives to present the Russian Revolution as an autonomous and unexpected episode, even though it was prepared in the course of an uninterrupted theoretical and practical struggle that lasted for many years. As an event that cannot be a part of a world revolutionary strategy. In short, as a kind of historical anomaly, a discovery that was undoubtedly brilliant, but one that will not be repeated, and that is to be attributed not so much to a party as to Lenin the individual. On the contrary, it is a theoretical thesis and fundamental practical teaching that the October Revolution was the result of a long preparation, during which the following principles had been defined with increasing clarity. The decisive role of the class party, the leading role, then the hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution being planned in Russia, the need for a reciprocal link between this revolution and the European Revolution, the inevitable transition from the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry in the bourgeois revolution, taken to its conclusion with the struggle for socialism, which will only end in victory in Russia with the support of the victorious proletariat in the countries of advanced capitalism. This revolutionary prologue demonstrates, and this is why we have focused on it, that in all fidelity to Marxism, the Bolsheviks immediately excluded any possibility of building socialism in Russia without the help of a world communist revolution. This international perspective, invoked 1,000 times, became a tangible reality at the outbreak of World War in 1914. The Bolsheviks proclaimed without hesitation that the supreme phase of capitalism was beginning for the entire historical period opened by the First World Massacre. For all countries presented two alternatives, war or revolution, and from its birth, the Third International would translate this perspective into the following political terms: either dictatorship of the proletariat or dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. All the justifications put forward to induce the working class to renounce its historical mission by supporting the war would be irrevocably rejected. No defensism was permitted under any pretext. The proletariat has no civilization, no democracy, no fatherland to save or defend, especially since it is not for them that the great powers entered the war, but to divide up the world, to conquer markets, and to oppress other peoples more than ever. There is nothing to save or defend. We must attack and destroy. Let the proletariat not implore peace. Let it practice revolutionary defeatism. Let it fraternize with its class brothers in the opposing trenches. Let it sabotage its fatherland. Let it fight to transform the imperialist war into civil war. Let it strike with the same conviction against open support for the war and for its rejection with the one and the only proletarian solution: revolution. These watchwords know no borders. They apply to the proletariat of France as well as the proletariat of Germany, England, and Russia. Because if Russia was not yet bourgeois enough to be fully capitalist, it is capitalist enough to be imperialist, and the infernal march of the imperialism has united it in the same bloodletting with all the other bourgeoisies of the world and their destiny. In Petrograd, as in Paris or London, in Vienna or Berlin, it is futile to invoke the need to defend the fatherland in order to preserve the supreme good of the threatened democracy or civilization. Futile for Tsarism allied to the Western democracies, but futile also for the post-Tsarist bourgeois democracy, which was even more interested in the military victory of the Entente. The Bolshevik perspective was unique, let us repeat, and immediate, its framework global. The revolution would break out in Russia, and at the least at the start, it would be a democratic revolution pushed to the very end. In Europe, the socialist revolution would break out, quote, but in all the advanced countries, the war has placed on the order of the day the slogan of socialist revolution, a slogan that is the more urgent, the more heavily the burden of war presses upon the shoulders of the proletariat, and the more active its future role must become in the recreation of Europe. After the horrors of the present patriotic barbarism in conditions of the tremendous technological progress of large-scale capitalism, unquote. Finally, the continuation of the war would increasingly bring to the fore the need for a new-found international on the ruins of the second, in other words, that of the social chauvinist or social pacifist parties, whose conciliating center was just as reactionary as the right, if not more so.